Here's a participatory video to go with Tommy's discussion at Adept Play called Horses on Squares. And it kind of is a spiritual successor to an older post about movement and maps. One of the commenters, going by Shimrod, brought up that timing is perhaps more important than spatial considerations in terms of whether formal grids, squares, hexes, whatever, in tabletop role-playing cause more problems than they solve. And I think he's absolutely right. The timing of the conduct of actions during play is really the critical issue here. But the way that interacts with the formal mapping phenomenon is very, very useful. So anyway, I'm going to make some points about that, which I think are sort of subtle, but I don't want to talk to anybody about this unless they know the rules for Melee. Published by Metagaming in 1977, and costing, as it says here, a magnificent $2.95, and a critical publication in the history of tabletop role-playing. Pamphlet, as you can see, not particularly lengthy, with one of the greatest covers of the hobby of all time, and also, well, as I say, conceptually, a big bang moment for the hobby. So what we're talking about here is a skirmish rules set that in this formulation is sort of presented as, well, use this in some other role-playing game, within a few years, it would be the core of a role-playing game called The Fantasy Trip in the Labyrinth. Now, this also does have, for the first time, The Fantasy Trip as a part of the cover, maybe part of the title. It was accompanied a year later by the famous Wizard. So these two together are the dynamic duo that became the core of In the Labyrinth, published in 1980. But anyway, all of those, including all sorts of little, modular spin-offs, Grail Quest, Death Test 1 and 2, things like that, all of those, the core is Melee, okay? And so we don't really need to look at all those other elaborations for our purposes. So how is this done? What do I think you need to know? Well, the first is, here is the little map that came in the same case, which I still have, the little cellophane bag that you buy it in. Not even Ziploc. Nope, this may actually have been before Ziploc. Maybe, or at least they didn't make them for this. Well, anyway, so when you fold it out, you've got the hexes, and you've got mega hexes. All of these are familiar to older practitioners of war games. A hex is given sort of the size unit of a person. So a person plus a little extra room. So a person could lean this way or lean that way, or sort of reach to touch another hex. But your sphere of activity is your hex and kind of the edges of all the hexes in your front. So you've got your front three that you're in contact with, your back two on either side, which are your side hexes, and then the one in the back, which is the rear hex. So, it's kind of this similar to the clock model, watch your six, which in this case, we have 6 units rather than 12. Okay. With all this in mind, I want to tell you how movement, ordering, and hexes are integrated in this design. It may not be quite what you expect, thinking about the way most similar techniques turned out later in tabletop role-playing. So, consideration number one. if you have a bunch of figures, that's the term they use, a bunch of figures on the map, and they are combatants. And if you have 2 players, so let's say we have 2 players and I've got 1 to 5 figures, and you're the other player and you've got 1 to 5 figures. And just to let you know, here's the little squares that are the figure counters that you lay flat on there. And they also came with triangular ones for the giants. Note the famous bell bottoms with the incredible art of Liz Danforth. And we also have, in Wizard, we've got these 4-hex diamonds for bigger creatures and even the 7-hex dragons. But anyway, with all of this stated, we have this sequence. So the first thing that happens is each player rolls a die, and the high one can either go first or have the other one go first. And however, before they touch anything, they have to state which option every single one of their figures is going to be doing. So charge attack, which means you can move up to half your movement allowance and attack. Or, missile attack. We are allowed to shift 1 hex and missile attack or remain where you are. Things like that. Every single option has a dedicated movement allowance in it. Sometimes it's flexible, but sometimes it's not. Obviously, as you probably know from tons of other games, if you move more than half of your movement allowance, then you can't attack. So in this game, your full movement allowance is a sprint, okay? So it's not like you can go double if you run or something like that. No, this is the max. All right, so with that stated, you have stated each option for each of your figures. And if it's your turn, either because you took the high initiative or you designated the other person to do it, you do the movement of that option for every single figure and move them all where they go. Then the other player does the same, states all the options, and then moves all of their figures where each of those options go, including the options that are flexible. So if you're going to, attack, and you're allowed to move 1 hex as long as you're not breaking the engagement rules, it's not like you wait until the attack later to decide whether to shift or not. No, you do all the movement that you plan on doing with that option now. So all the figures have moved, and they're ordered by player in terms of that initiative roll and the decision made about it. Now, all the figures finish their actions. If the action included a roll or any content basically beyond the movement, now is when they do it, and they do it in order of individual figure dexterity. Technically adjusted dexterity, because armor brings your dexterity down, stuff like that in the game. But whatever each figure's adjusted dexterity is at this moment, including penalties or bonuses from the last round, that's the order in which the figures act, from highest to lowest. So let's consider some realities, or let's consider some fictions about this reality of the kind of procedure. The first thing to recognize is that the combat round does not consist of sequential subunits of time. The combat round happens all at once. Everybody's going as fast as they can, and everybody is, in fictional terms, in constant motion. There is no, I go here and do this, and now it's my turn. Time starts for me. Now I go here and do that, individual by individual. No. the combat round is defined as everybody does a thing, period. And the ordering of the individual actions is very much a momentary phenomenon of where their various adjusted dexterities have come to at this moment. And I need to emphasize again the shift from a method like this to later tabletop methods that superficially look quite similar is enormous. Before I get to that shift, I would like to clarify how this related to other tabletop games at that era, in that moment of 1977, 1978. Someone will have to educate me about Chivalry and Sorcery, because even though I have it, I don't feel like digging it out right now and going through the itsy bitsy script. Someone's going to have to tell me. The same thing for Early Traveler, also somewhere about that is going to be sort of hellish to go and do. I'd rather work with games that I have played extensively. So someone else who's played those games extensively, tell me. But I can speak for early Dungeons & Dragons, both the 1974 publication, which was reprinted in 1978, which is how I got it, and then the early RuneQuest, 1978-79. I can speak, and also Tunnels and Trolls. Now, the interesting thing is that none of them used a marked map. None of them. They used real-world measurements. In the case of Dungeons and Dragons, 10 feet, 60 feet, whatever. And then in the case of RuneQuest, they used meters, being forward thinkers. And Tunnels and Trolls didn't bother much. I mean, again, it was more like D&D. It was more interested in ranges for things like missile fire rather than movements in small increments or subsets of what a person could do to move. Bearing in mind as well that the Tunnels and Trolls combat round was 3 minutes of fictional time. That the Dungeons and Dragons combat round was 1 minute of fictional time. RuneQuest chopped it up into seconds and had a very interesting thing called Strike Rank, which I really wish people would play more carefully, which makes a hell of a lot of sense. But you have to have this theater of the mind of how far this is to that. But you don't need a grid for that. You just need, if you want a visual map, you will just have a map and say, well, how far is that? And be done. You don't need demarcations of the subsets. Now, even the text in Tunnels and Trolls mentions miniatures and it's a little baffled. It's kind of like, well, I guess it's kind of cool to have like your guy, I guess. But you can see that the authors have no idea how putting figures and maneuvering them on a map has anything to do with playing the game. So bearing in mind that none of those games had movement, well, RuneQuest does, but it does it in a different fashion. But Dungeons and Dragons and Tunnels and Trolls do not have this notion of, I get to go this far and do that, baked into any kind of physicality of game instruments. And that the time units that are managed by their resolution rolls are immense and explicitly, in both games, account for tons of activity. Your roll to hit is basically a huge exchange of, swordplay and fangs and stuff. It's not a hit. So melee is really, really different in that an action is extraordinarily known in time. It is your option. You have chosen to parry this round, and that is what you are doing in terms of this incoming attack at this moment. And the amount of fictional time that this effort accounts for is much, much, much smaller. But again, it's not conducted in raw sequence, so that when I do the movement of my characters, they get their movement first, or I make you go first, in terms of sort of the group collective strategizing fictionally, so that when, just before we do all the resolutions, we've moved all our figures, it didn't really matter which one you moved first while you were ordering your figures into the different new spots. The order in which you did it has no fictional reality. You're playing out where they all got to when the others get their movement. The other side, matches it. And sort of which the initiative is kind of which one had this slight advantageous jump on the other in terms of this collective maneuvering and the actual sequence of doing it with you and your figure or figures isn't fictionally real. It has no fictional, ordered identity. The resolution of the executions of each of those options, to use my terminology, is ordered, but it's ordered by dexterity of the characters and not by that initiative roll in any way, shape, or form. And they are also properly considered to be as simultaneous as the characters would like. Every character wants to be faster than all the others in terms of getting their action off, and the dexterity set basically how far they got in doing that. It's not like any of them was waiting for their turn. Okay, everybody kind of seeing that you are creating fiction very retroactively per player action. You are, when the round is said and done, we know where everybody went, who had the slight advantage in movement, and what they were able to make of it. We know how each of the rolls went, and now we know the new damage, the new penalties and bonuses that have accrued or applied, and the various results. This character may have been knocked prone, for example. If you are playing with multiple players in Melee, so that each player has one or more figures, the same rules apply. So that I would roll a die for my characters or figures initiative. And you see now that it's actually not fictionally related to which side. So even the notion that this side communicated better and maneuvered better relative to the other side doesn't really make that much sense. It's much more a player thing of you get to maneuver the figures that you have authority over. You're the one choosing the option for each one of them, after all, and then applying the movements. So the relationship between the initiative roll and fictional circumstances has to be retroactive. We have to see where everybody ended up and then come up with whatever in fiction justification, that these guys are just organized better than the others, or know what their parts are in things, or, hey, it just flew that way this time. Never mind why. Some why. But it has to be this retroactive thing. It is not defined by anything that says, okay, this player gets to move their figures first because this player's figures are fictionally distinctive in any way. We can't even associate player with side of the battle necessarily, because as soon as you have more than two players, that just flies out the window. And yet you're not rolling initiative for the movement option per character. You're still doing it by person. Again, therefore, the fictional justification of the ordering is retroactive.